Math 1332, Chapter 3, Symbolic Logic, Section 4, Logical Arguments, Video 1. What is a logical argument? We're not actually going to be figuring anything out in this video. We're just going to be talking about a concept, defining a few things. But when the time is right, we will start figuring things out, yes, with truth tables. Although there are some problems where we can bypass truth tables, as we'll see towards the end. But let's start by defining what a logical argument is. A logical argument is a set of statements called premises, which is plural, the singular is premise, and a conclusion that may or may not follow from those premises. So as the definition implies, the conclusion doesn't necessarily have to be a follow-up to the premises. You just have some statements called premises and a conclusion. I got something hiding under here. I do not. So why do we study logical arguments? Well, you hear people making conclusions all the time. Politicians are notorious for this. Statement number 1, blah, blah, blah. Statement number 2, blah, blah, blah. Statement number 3, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, some conclusion. But politicians aren't the only ones that use logical arguments. If you pay close attention to media, to presenters, to anybody that's trying to make a point about something, they usually set up some premises and end with some sort of conclusion. Blah, 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 blah. Therefore, you should, blah, 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 blah. But you'd be surprised how many people are bad at logical arguments. Some people say logical arguments is the same thing as common sense. I wish. But so why do we study logical arguments? Well, simply speaking, people in general aren't good at drawing logically correct conclusions. Using symbolic logic, we will develop a method for determining if a conclusion must follow from a set of premises. And the nice thing about this is by approaching it symbolically and removing the words, we remove the things that might influence us or bias us when we're making our decisions or making our conclusions. So we try to make it as objective as possible by removing all the subjectivity from the argument. For example, let's suppose the following two statements are true. I'm not saying they are true, but let's suppose they are. Statement number 1, if I get a pay raise at work, then I will take my family on vacation. And again, I'm not saying that statement is true or false, but just let's assume that it's true. Statement number 2, I took my family on vacation. Can you draw a conclusion? Again, the two statements are, if I get a pay raise at work, then I will take my family on vacation. And then later, I took my family on vacation. What conclusion can you draw? Can you draw a conclusion? Many people would conclude that I got a pay raise at work. But is that logically sound? In other words, if the two premises were true, the conditional for statement number 1 and the simple statement for statement number 2, must it logically follow that I got a pay raise at work? Well, is there a way that they could both be true and I didn't get a pay raise? If I get a pay raise at work, then I'll take my family on vacation. I promise. Later, I took my family on vacation. Is it possible I could have taken on vacation without getting a pay raise? Yes. Maybe my wife got a pay raise. Maybe I played a poker game and won a lot of money. Maybe I won a vacation on a contest on a radio or something. But it is possible for the two premises to be true without me getting a pay raise at work. But most people would say, oh, I guess you got a pay raise at work. And that's an example of drawing a bad conclusion. Now, we haven't proven that this is an invalid argument yet, but when the time is right, we will do that. Kind of took the wind from my own sails, but in other words, must this conclusion follow logically from these premises? And what does that even mean? Well, let's define some things. An argument is valid, so the word we're defining is valid argument, An argument is valid if the conclusion follows logically from the premises. Otherwise, the argument is invalid. So those are going to be our types of arguments, valid or invalid. Must a conclusion logically follow from a set of premises? Let's take a look at another example. And keep in mind that I haven't shown you how to determine if a conclusion must follow. In other words, I haven't shown you how to determine if an entire argument, premises, and conclusion is valid or not. But let's take a look at this one, see if you can draw a conclusion. Statement number 1, all students who study for a test will pass the test. I'm not asking if this is true or false. We're going to say if this is true, must the conclusion follow. All students who study for a test will pass the test. John, a student, studies for a test. It should say the test. 1 second. There we go. Number 1, all students who study for the test will pass the test. Number 2, John, a student, studies for the test. Can you draw a conclusion? Can you draw a conclusion under the assumption that the premises are true? Most people can. Therefore, what conclusion would you draw? I'm the teacher. All students who study for the test will pass the test. Let's assume that's true. John studies for the test. Can we conclude something? Sure. John will pass the test. Most people would agree that the argument is valid in the sense that the conclusion necessarily follows from the premise. Necessarily follows from the premises, whatever that means. But notice I didn't mention anything about the premises being true, which is kind of a lie. I said, let's assume that they're true and see if the conclusion follows. When you're looking at a logical argument, you're not really questioning the truth value of the premises. What you're questioning is, must the conclusion follow from these premises? I'm just saying, if the premises were true, then the conclusion would necessarily have to follow. At least it seems like it should follow. Now, of course, I know how this story ends, and I can tell you right now, yes, that is a valid conclusion because this is a valid argument. But to emphasize that determining the validity of an argument has nothing to do with the actual truth values of the statements, but rather the relationship between the premises and the conclusion, let's take a look at one more. Consider the following argument. If my name is Chris, it is, then I live on Mars. That can't be true. Clearly it's not. My name is Chris and I do not live on Mars. But let's assume that that statement is true for a second. And then I tell you my name is Chris. Here's the two premises. If my name is Chris, then I live on Mars. My name is Chris. Can you draw a conclusion? Therefore, Chris, I live on Mars. I clearly don't live on Mars. Does that make this argument invalid? It does not. In fact, this is a valid argument. But the reason it sounds weird is because the first premise is clearly not true. It's the broken promise. My name is Chris is true. I live on Mars is false. Broke my promise. It's a false statement. But determining the validity of an argument has nothing to do with determining the truth values of the premises. The validity of an argument is based on whether or not the conclusion would follow from the premises if they were true. Clearly, I do not live on Mars. But if the first premise were true, it's not. And the second premise were true, it is. Then I would conclude that I live on Mars. So to summarize, a logical argument is just a set of premises and a conclusion that may or may not logically follow. And our task is to answer the question, when is an argument valid? Meaning, when does the conclusion logically follow from the premises?